Welcome everyone. A quick note that we are recording and the recording will be published on our YouTube channel, History at Newcastle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, wherever you may be located, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and in particular to the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people of the land on which the Callaghan campus resides and where we in the room are located today. Our presenter today, Julie McIntyre, is an Associate Professor of History at the University of Newcastle, Australia. She directs Newcastle's Wine Studies Research Network and serves on the steering committee for the Australian Aotearoa New Zealand Environmental History Network. Her research career has focused on wine in Australia across several themes, most recently Indigenous settler colonial relations and industry, and she's writing a global history of Australia for Princeton University Press. Her paper today discusses research completed during special study leave in Canada during 2023 as part of a collaboration called Settler Vines. Her paper is titled Connecting Australian and First Nations Histories with Settler Colonial Winegrape Cultivation. Julie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I acknowledge too that we're meeting on the unceded land of the Pamalong clan of the Awabakal people. Again, my gratitude and respect to Awabakal people for their millennia of care for country. I acknowledge too that the research and writing of the work I'm presenting took place mostly on the ancestral lands of the Awabakal, but also of Canadian First Nations, particularly the Osoyoos Indian Band in what is now called British Columbia. Many thanks to Sasha for captaining the ship. That is our history research seminar series. And Michelle Sear also did a little bit of research work that contributed to some of what I'm going to talk about today. Thank you all for being here. So I'm making this requirement, just a bit repetitive to mention it, but I'm making the requirement, the paper, the presentation. I'm making the presentation as a requirement for taking overseas study leave in the first half of last year. So this isn't so much work in progress as discussing what I did and taking the opportunity to talk a little bit at first, in fact, about that experience, because I think there are benefits in sharing that. So even though I've been working for some years on the project for Princeton University Press that seeks to understand Australia in a global context along several lines of inquiry, I do continue with my wine studies work. This is about the relationship between people and the wine grape plant Vitis vinifera and how this cultivation is connected with currents of historical change. Last year's sabbatical leave focused on three separate endeavours, foremost actually working in blissful isolation on a section of the new book manuscript. That was fantastic. But also returning to my Fulbright program archive, which is the University of California Davis Special Collections, where I've started an environmental history project that explores how a collaboration between the university's wine grape scientists and engineers contributed to the growth in the mechanical industrialisation of grape harvesting and pruning that's enabled massive expansion of the global winescape, bringing us to the fact that these days 3/4 of the world's vineyards are mechanised. And I'm interested in this mechanisation as a chapter in the late 20th century history of wine growing as a commodity frontier. So that's separate to the work on the Princeton University Press book. But the third endeavour on my study leave was in two parts. So I spent 3 months overseas altogether. The first 2 weeks of that I spent at the University of British Columbia with historians who invited me to spend some time with them. And then at the end of the 3 months, I had 2 weeks with historians at the University of Toronto before I returned to Newcastle. So that bookending was a really terrific experience, because at UBC Vancouver, I presented a paper that included some of the research I'll discuss today, and the audience for that paper included Indigenous women from the UBC viticulture program, including one young woman who hopes to become Canada's first female Indigenous winemaker. So it was such a pleasure to meet her. At UBC's Colonial campus, I lectured to environmental history students about the history of reliance on irrigated water for growing wine grapes for often expensive or non-premium wine in the Riverina wine region of New South Wales, which is a part of the Murrumbidgee irrigation area. Then at Toronto, I presented work from today's paper to colleagues at an international food studies dialogue between University of Toronto's Culinaria program and the University of Bologna, Italy. This also contributed to my preparation to teach a global food history course here at Newcastle in second semester last year. So a highlight of the trip was actually one of the world's foremost food historians standing in his office at Toronto, just scooping books off the shelf and saying, here, take these home, take these home. So my luggage was really heavy, but the thing is, it was one of those really magnificent moments of exchange where some of the work that he kind of just handed to me and that we discussed has then enlivened the students here. So one of the students who I hope to foster into honours next year was particularly taken with some of this, and that was really from that moment of being there with that historian and having him talk about the things that had worked in his courses. And also finally, I also gave a lecture there, a guest lecture to students in food studies, food history course about the type of work that I'm talking about today. And I would say each of these guest lectures I gave big rooms full of students, and they had fun. It was great. It was really interesting to talk to them about a part of the world they think about for certain, but the idea of them having an opportunity to compare some thinking was really generative for me as well. Finally, as part of the visit to Toronto, I presented a paper at the Canadian Historical Association conference at York University, and this was along with colleagues from the Settler Vines project that originated at York University and has resulted in the publication of a special issue of the Journal of the Canadian Historical Association, and I'm talking about that mainly today. I'd like to say how grateful I am to the Canadian historians whose invitations funded a good deal of my study leave beyond the terrific support we get from the university, because this included a visit to Incomeep Wines, which belongs to the Osoyoos Indians.
Yeah, too long.
Been wanting to go there for years, and going there with a research basis was terrific. Titled Settler Vines, Rethinking the History of Wine Production. So there are three case studies that I'm going to talk about that are the spine of my presentation. I'd like to note too that as a non-Indigenous historian, there are no Indigenous Australian historians currently researching the role of Australian First Nations in wine growing for me to collaborate with. So I'm therefore holding space with a relational approach for Indigenous researchers who may seek in future to pursue questions and take this area in their own direction about Indigenous settler relations. And winegrape cultivation, of course, I'm not going to go into this today. There is plenty of work historically about Indigenous settler relations in other areas of agriculture and commodity production. I'm just saying I'm sort of holding space in this particular topic. It will help you to know that Vitis vinifera is the plant species used to grow grapes to make wine. Vitis vinifera is not native to Oceania. The genus Vitis is endemic to Eurasia and America. And vinifera as a species of the genus evolved in what we now know as Eastern Europe. I'm not going to rehearse the history of grapes, wine, or even Australia's wine history. I find it really interesting when I publish the work that I do because it often lands in all sorts of different theoretical areas that I do have to rehearse that again. I won't for time, but you're more than welcome to ask if there's something you feel that is a gap in what you're understanding from what I'm talking about. So in terms of what would be the paper itself here, there is ample evidence that English imperialists perceived the potential to profit from wine growing in temperate climate colonies from as early as the 17th century. Aspirations to introduce and acclimatise Vitis vinifera to colonised territories form part of the cultural baggage of English and then British imperial reach into the Atlantic and Pacific oceanic regions from the earliest colonising voyages. British colonists in New South Wales considered winegrape cultivation and wine consumption as potential pacifying forces, not of First Peoples, but of convict and working class labour forces required to build a new economic and cultural order in the colony. Vine stock and a panoply of economic, social, cultural and environmental ideas about wine growing subsequently circulated to other colonies. As Erica Hannickel has shown, Quote, settler colonial North Americans and Australians sought to prove themselves and their landscapes as solidly located within the accepted Western narrative of world history, which claimed that all powerful nations since antiquity had successful great cultures, end quote. Indeed, it's a kind of apotheosis of civilization. As Maggie Brady, Gillian Barnes and I have argued in research published in 2019, most settler capitalists imbued with these ideas that I've just mentioned who grew wine grapes in Australia did so with non-Aboriginal labour. So the case studies that I'm going to talk about here are focused on three different parts of Australia in the late 19th and very early 20th century. And what I'm essentially talking to you about here is where there is some evidence of historical entanglements in settler vinifera relations in which Indigenous people are part of stories from which they would usually have been erased to make way otherwise for triumphal narratives of settler economic and social success. So there's archival research involved here, but this is also very much glimpsed histories. It's the needle in the haystack thing where some of what has come to me over the years that is discussed here has resulted from a kind of cumulative sense of I've been working in this research area for 20 years. And so this has enabled me to glimpse these case studies that I'm discussing. The first one's based in the ancestral land of the Wonnarua, including Gringai, Gurungai, Guigal, and henceforth I'll refer to them as Gringai and Kamilaroi, so places that are now encompassed in the Hunter Valley. Despite the escalation of settler-Indigenous violence in the Hunter from the 1820s, members of the Gringai clan continued until the 1840s to coexist with settlers on at least 3 of the colonial estates where aspirational wine growing took place, alongside what were, in fact, at that point, much more profitable pursuits, such as crops or grazing cattle. During this time, British landowner Charles Boydell of Camerallen, near Maitland, developed close ties with Gringai. He recorded their language and rituals, and we have those records. As late as 1882, by which time Boydell's son James had inherited the property as a second-generation settler colonists, a group of Gringai still camped at Camerallen. James Boydell cared for Gringai at, I'm quoting him now, a hospital of my own of sick blacks, end quote, and lamented that promises of government assistance for these people had not materialised. He says too, Blind Sally died as the, I'm quoting again, manager of the Maloga mission took away 15 men, women and children, which is a great relief to me. This is Boydell. I sincerely trust that some good may be done for these poor creatures, end quote. So how this removal of the group from Boydell's property to Maloga came about is charismatic Christians Daniel and Janet Matthews founded Maloga Aboriginal Mission on the New South Wales bank of the Murray River, which borders New South Wales and Victoria in 1870 to house, provision and minister to Aboriginal people. Over the next few years, Daniel Matthews travelled throughout the colony seeking settler donations to bolster the finances of the mission, which also received funding from the Aborigines Protection Association of New South Wales and the Office of the Colonial Secretary. Matthews' colonial connections included the Anglican community at Maitland. According to Maitland newspaper reports, Matthews, the word they chose is induced the Gringai to travel from Camerallen to Maloga, implying that this removal of First Nations from their ancestral land constituted a clever, kind and non-coercive act. The perceived good Matthews provided for the Gringai from Camerallen may also be described as welfare bestowed under conditions of Christian doctrinal control and exclusion from land ownership under settler colonial law, at a distance from urban labour markets. A month later, Maitland supporters of Maloga raised £36 as an instalment in donations to the mission. On receiving the funds, Matthews wrote in reply, block quote, "The blacks from Camerallen are getting on grandly. They are a happy people and are quite at home with the others. One of the women, Rosie, was helping me to prepare the food for the schoolhouse children yesterday. She seemed so thankful for being at a real home and her little girl going to school. She said to me, 'I would like the people in Maitland to see us now, Mr. Matthews. My dear wife and I,'" this is Matthews telling the story again, "long to see more of these poor and neglected people cared for in the same way. It is a grand work, and we long to see it prosper and extend." End quote. So there is no document record in the voice of Rosie and her kin at Maloga, but their recorded actions dispute Matthew's story. Maloga Mission Station is significant in Australia's settler-Indigenous histories of Christianity, as well as histories of land dispossession and the colonial establishment of mission stations and reserve lands, ostensibly providing colonial protection for Aboriginal people during a perceived racialised decline. The significance is that the Matthews claimed in the summer of late 1883 through to early 1884 to have overcome the resistance of 98 of the mission's Aboriginal residents and achieved a mass conversion of historic proportions. Historian Claire McCliskey interprets this landmark event as owing, quote, as much to Aboriginal people's past connections to and future aspirations for their traditional lands as they did to the institution known as Maloga, end quote. The Gringai we've been talking about from Camerallen did not, however, participate in this conversion event. Early in 83, Daniel Matthews advised that, quote, so he advised the people back in Maitland, your people from Maitland are longing for their home again, end quote, and hoped a mission station might be formed in 2 potential locations in the Maitland district. Despite Matthews' testimony that Rosie was satisfied at Maloga, she was likely among the 13 people who in early 83 suddenly left the mission to travel home. I don't know how they travelled. It must have been an extraordinary journey. I just can't find anything that tells us how they travelled, but it's quite a distance, as you know, back from the New South Wales-Victoria border. So in early 83, they suddenly left the mission to travel home to Matthew's, quote, regret and disappointment, as we had shown them great kindness and had been the means in God's hands of preserving them from the misery and vice of their former experience for the time being, end quote. So it's not clear why 2 fewer Gringai returned home from Maloga than the 15 Boydell recorded as going there. A report in the Maitland Mercury stated with far less fanfare than the announcement of the Gringai's departure from Maitland that Matthews, in fact, found the Maitland blacks, which is how these people were referred to in newspapers and other documents at the time, to be, quote, dissatisfied from the first, end quote. Rosie and her kin refused to be banished from their country, although Boydell and other settlers insisted they had no place in and around Maitland unless they developed independence from settler care. Yet the settler colonial order offered the Gringai no right to freehold land ownership or labour opportunities they were prepared to accept. An impasse, it appears colonists, including Boydell, were not prepared to resolve. There was, in fact, a mission set up. I haven't discussed that. It was not at Maitland, but in the region, just to tie that up. But I want to move on to the second case study. Due to the lack of Aboriginal land rights in Australia until the late 20th century, settler colonial employer-Indigenous labour relations, and particularly settler colonial employer-Indigenous labour relations mediated around Indigenous residents at mission stations, is the main junction through which Indigenous histories are connected with settler colonial winegrowing. That is to say that there are mission stations, I'm about to talk about one of them, but there are others where Aboriginal people were then used as labourers in local vineyards, one particularly at Sackville Reach, which is on the Hawkesbury River in Darug country. So Maggie Brady, Gillian Barnes and I explored 2 notable connections, and I'm going to speak about one of them because what this project allowed me to do was go a little bit deeper into that case study with some new records. So in Victoria in the late 19th century, Kulin Nation leader William Barak, a sober Christian, lived at Corandurk Mission. In the 1880s, colonial government policies began to move more decisively toward preventing Aboriginal freehold land ownership. Despite articulate entreaties by Barak and his community, the successes achieved through Aboriginal settler administrative collaboration at Corandurk, a Kulin word, were undermined by new but hostile settler colonial management, leading to the economic and social fracturing of the Kulin at Corandurk. Meanwhile, the settler colonial Swiss property that became Yeringberg, Yering is a Kulin word, one of the main winegrape enterprises of the Yarra Valley in Victoria, lay adjacent to Corandurk from the 1860s. As well as owning Yeringberg and being a trusted friend of Barak, Guillaume de Pury served as a leading, so the de Pury property is Yeringberg, and the the main settler colonial owner of that property, served as a leading member of the Swiss community of the Yarra Valley, contributed to the establishment of the white rural shire of Lilydale, and he also participated in the Commission of Inquiry into the future of Aboriginal cooperative management of Corranderk in 1881. So the Dupuris and Brack and Corranderk are very entangled. Dupuris' death in 1890 led to his elder son George assuming management of Winegrape. So here we have a second generation settler colonial story again, as the Australian colonies experienced the first serious economic depression in 50 years. This is in 1890, reducing domestic demand for Dupuris wines. Over the next decade, George Dupuy pulled out every second row of his vines, exchanging the original system of close planting for high per acre yields with space for a horse-drawn plough. This lowered human labour costs for Dupuy, but may have also removed labour opportunities for the Kulin. So this is the context for farm daybook entries by George Dupuy in mid-April 1901, when Kulin, whom Dupuy referred to as blacks, so I'm using the language from the record here, still occasionally gained employment at Winegrapes. So the April 10 entry states, quote, went to Black Station, which is how I referred to Corranderk, got 16 blacks to pick grapes, and he's referring to Red Hermitage, which is not really relevant for my argument here. On April 11, the grape harvest commenced with same grape variety. They're nice and ripe. They're ready to be harvested. Fritz is overseeing the blacks in the vineyard. So here there's an intersection of most likely, given Fritz's name, a German-speaking immigrant who may have been part of the waves of German-speaking immigrants who did assist in wine growing around the colonies. Fritz, the point I partly want to make there too is Fritz gets a name and the blacks do not. On the 13th of April, Dupuy, quote, paid off the blacks. So unfortunately, but not unexpectedly, he didn't name the Aboriginal employees. It is interesting, however, that he does talk about paying them. So what we have here is payment. Doesn't say if it's currency, what sort of currency, but it does suggest something that is more supportive of Aboriginal economic participation than a mutual arrangement through bartering for labour or non-payment at all, which beset, as we know, a good deal of Aboriginal colonial labour arrangements. On the 15th of July, 1902, Dupuy, quote, and I'm sorry, I'm right down in the weeds here because this is the records we have, so that there's tiny little slivers of evidence. On the 15th of July, 1902, Dupuy, quote, put on black boy tying leaders. So what that means is tying vine canes in the vineyard. This entry is underlined. So the employment of the black boy may have been a favour to Barak, who was a very close friend of the Dupuys. And there's lots of other evidence of that I won't detail, but it's a very strong relationship. So the employment of the black boy may have been a favour to Barak or another Kulin man, Johnny Terrick, who was a part of the relationship between Corranderk and Winegrapes. Or compared with other underlined entries, which are not common in the daybook, so that's why I'm talking about it, the underlining may indicate the need to make a payment to the black worker. This boy appears to have worked only for one day. Other boys employed are not referred to by colour, so there's a racialisation here in industrial relations. On the 21st of July, quoting directly from Dupuy's records, Fritz and Blackie began racking, which was transferring wine from one barrel to another, new white wines. The next day, Fritz and Blackie were racking new whites and began finishing old whites. That's the name of the wine. Entries for July 23rd and 24 both read, Fritz and Blackie racking white wines. On the 25th of July, and Blackie gets a capital letter, so we're probably talking about someone who's kind of well known here, but named in a way that, well, mind you, Fritz, the way Fritz is named is not either especially respectful, but I think we're talking here about a record that is going to be condensing these people's names, but I think it's really interesting to hear how they're referred to. So Fritz and Blackie are racking white wines again on the 23rd and the 24th. On the 25th, This pair finishes that work, and they keep doing that on the 26th. They rest the following day, and then they complete it on the Monday together. So we get some picture of the working together that is happening too. We're able to imagine what's going on. A few days later, the pair cleaned up the winery and moved to building or repairing the kitchen drains. So by September, there's another mention of Fritz without Blackie, and I really read this as the sense that Fritz is somebody with some employment tenure and Blackie is seasonal. And that is a big difference, and that's a kind of racialised sense to seasonal labour without certainty is more likely to be someone who's coming from Corandurk. There are final entries hinting at Aboriginal labour at Uringberg. So these are the ones I've just read to you. That's kind of it that we've found at the moment. It may be that with Barak's death in 1903, the Depury relationship with the Black Station, as they called it, as a source of labour drew to a close. Until this time, Depury trusted and could afford the Corandurk residents he employed. Conversely, Corandurk residents appear to have increasingly limited opportunities, however, for paid work, as the wider white community of the region expressed similar hostilities towards them as had Maitland residents towards the Green Guy. Irrespective of evidence of Depury's benevolence towards the Kulin, the settler colonists' growing participation in colonial matters during this period coincided with the decline in opportunities and self-determination for Barak and the Kulin nation. Shared histories of colonial betterment responding with Indigenous dispossession is a common thread of colonisation in Australia. And the third case study, missionary Ewart relations at New Norcia Aboriginal Mission in Western Australia offer a different viewpoint again of relational histories in settler colonial wine growing. New Norcia was established in the mid-19th century, about 85 miles inland from Perth, by Spanish Catholic missionary Rosendo Salvado. Dom Salvado's journey to the southwestern corner of the Australian continent resulted from petitions by Catholics in the region for congregational leadership, as well as Salvado's calling, at the time with a fellow monk, to work, quote, for the conversion of native peoples in whatever part of the globe we should happen to be sent, end quote. Salvado, who's the record we have rather than Aboriginal voices, Salvado wrote tenderly and informatively of his initial dependence upon Ewart peoples for sustenance and navigation. Honestly, it is fascinating the way he talks about Aboriginal food. It is the most astonishing type of record for me. So Salvado learned Ewart names and their language. He and other monks later stationed at New Norcia understood that land obtained from the British Crown actually belonged first to the Ewart. Salvado strenuously fostered the stability and continuity of Ewart presence in this region and harboured other First Nations people, as long as the Aboriginal people met expectations of Christianity and settler colonial economy and society. Salvado began New Norcia with 20 acres of Ewart country and throughout 40 years expanded the mission property through lease and purchase from the British Crown to a further 950,000 acres of Aboriginal land. This included what is known in colonial discourse as marginal sheep grazing territory, which means it's unsuitable for agriculture. Within the mission territory, an Aboriginal village lay near a monastery. As many as 80 non-Indigenous brothers housed in the monastery trained Aboriginal people in farming and other manual work and educated Aboriginal children in reading, writing and music. So the historian Tiffany Shellam has traced Salvado's assigning of farming acreage and cattle to Ewart men, Billagoro, Dwergan, Nyabinga and Takenkat in 1848. 20 years later, these men petitioned the colonial government to own the land under colonial law. Although their campaign to regain this land did not succeed, Shellam points to the Ewart efforts as being significant in the more widely known Corandurk, and I've talked about Corandurk a little, agitation to own and farm their ancestral land. By the end of the 19th century at New Norcia, there was 80 acres of wine grape vineyards. So it's not clear when Salvado and his clerical brethren established these vines, but by the 1880s, the monks cared for them in all seasons with no evidence of Aboriginal workers assisting at any time. And they pressed the grapes by foot for fermentation. It was very Arcadian. Several settler colonial travellers delighted in visiting New Norcia, where their welcome included good food and wine. Given New Norcia's creation as a place of perceived economic, social and spiritual uplift of Aboriginal people, it's significant that there's no evidence of Aboriginal people employed in the vineyard there. The apparent absence of Aboriginal people from New Norcia's vineyards during Salvado's tenure until his death during a visit to Rome in 1900 may simply have been because sufficient labourers existed among the large number of monks. The absence of any evidence of Aboriginal people associated with the vineyards also infers the separation between wine as a part of the missionaries' Arcadian civilizational good life and where it was that they felt Aboriginal people belonged in this geography. Either way, the separation of Aboriginal people from New Norcia's vineyards and winery highlights the parallel lives lived by settler colonists and First Nations in their shared history at the mission. It's less surprising to find Aboriginal people excluded from the winery. Salvado would have been breaking the settler colonial law if he shared wine with the Indigenous residents of New Norcia. Settler colonists could not sell wine to Aboriginal people in Western Australia, or indeed anywhere in Australia at this time. This state of affairs marks a line between Indigenous and non-Indigenous experiences of colonisation. And Salvado's successor as abbot, Fulgencio Torres, made changes that extended this line of demarcation into a chasm. Torres marginalised New Norcia's Aboriginal residents through changes to the mission's operations and infrastructure, ushering in an era of their very poor treatment. Torres also made New Norcia's winemaking business oriented, which is not quite what Salvado was doing, compared with the rustic novelty favoured by Salvado. The point to be made here is the widening gap between Aboriginal people and settler colonists in rights not only to land, but to the idea of a good life as a civilisational benefit. It's been said that in the 1940s, a generation after Torres relocated and commodified the mission's wine grape enterprise, New Norcia monks enjoyed and ritualised vineyard labour. This experience of an imported form of Arcadian delight for the monks of New Norcia coincided with the transition in settler colonial government policies to the harshest yet suppression of Indigenous culture through the 50s and into the early 60s. So what can be said about these three case studies? Up to the turn of the 21st century, historical perspectives on wine growing, so what the historians did, in places colonised since the early modern era, including within the British Empire, tended to foreground what wine production brought to new lands in the way of civilisation, profit and pleasure. My research into shared histories of wine grape production aims to instead understand continuing divisions between cultural and economic citizenship for Indigenous Australians compared with non-Indigenous Australians. So I just want to say a few more things, though, about what that means now, if I have some time to do that. Oh, I do. I'm doing all right. Okay. I will go on. So the opening of new global wine markets from the 1990s in response to first settler colonial Australian wine marketing, followed by settler colonial New Zealand product innovations, coincided with a new era in self-determined Indigenous rights in knowledge making. Yet until recently, few historians have sought to connect Indigenous histories with settler colonial wine growing. In our 2019 study of Aboriginal participation in the settler colonial Australian wine industry, Maggie Brady, Gillian Barnes and I made brief mention of co-san labour in the South African Cape of Good Hope wine industry, and we also gestured to Maori involvement in the Aotearoa New Zealand industry. So that's in addition to the fact that we were able from that piece to make the argument that we could find very little evidence of Aboriginal people working in vineyards, and that we found one instance of Aboriginal ownership of a vineyard, and I'll get to that in a minute. Also, in terms of what's been going on research-wise in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Pākehā anthropologist of the wine industry, Peter Howland, acknowledges Maori dispossession and the colonial after-effects of settler colonialism. But it's Owen White's outstanding history, The Blood of the Colony, that is I think, possibly one of the most powerful book in this space in the last few years. And there's also some new work. We're sort of at the cusp of this right now, but I just want to mention White's book. So The Blood of the Colony documents the mainly French Euro-Algerian wine industry's transformation of the Algerian landscape, society and economy during French colonisation from the 1830s to the 1950s, and the destruction of Algerian livelihoods through rapid French decolonisation in the 1960s. From White, we understand that in Algeria, as a contemporary informed him, now children were taught in school that the vine was the devil's crop. I won't attempt the French version of that, but it's the devil's crop now, which I think is a really interesting counterpoint to the fact that, by contrast, wine growing is less divisive in settler colonial nations where the colonisers have not left, as they did through Algerian decolonisation. So to come back to some things I learned in Canada's British Columbia, the Osoyoos Indian Band has since 1968 leased its tribal land to wine companies, and from the 1980s operated its own winegrape vineyards, winery and tourism facilities. Indeed, Clarence Louis, chief of the Osoyoos Indian Band, is proud that the band of 540 members employs more than 1,000 people in enterprises that include Incomeat Vineyards and a wine brand operated in partnership with Antira Wines, which is a settler colonial company. Although Osoyoos employment opportunities since the 1960s have included apple picking and packing and forestry, Chief Louis singles out, and so this is in an autobiography that he's written, he singles out the winegrape vineyards on Osoyoos land as significant to his people's fortitude and self-determination. Quote, "For most youth in the 1970s, working in a vineyard was our first summer job," end quote. From 12 or 13 years of age, and children in vineyards is a whole other thing, by the way, it's for another time. From 12 or 13 years of age, during the fruiting season, Chief Louis and others harvested grapes from 5 o'clock in the morning and laboured for 8 hours, earning $2 per hour before the height of the day's heat over the desert landscape. Because of this, quoting Chief Louis again, tough job training ground, most of our people are very hard-working, end quote. Incomeat, which brands itself as the world's first Indigenous-owned winery, and I think they can definitely claim that, has employed an Osoyoos vineyard manager since the 1980s and an Osoyoos winemaker since 2009. So in earlier research, Brady Barnes and I found only one Aboriginal Australian-owned wine grape vineyard. So what this is from 1998 to 2010, the Murrin Bridge Aboriginal Land Council supported the suggestion by an Italian-Australian winery owner from sort of broadly their region to plant, cultivate and harvest wine grapes on the central New South Wales land that the Murrin Bridge community owned and managed collectively since 1983. The grape growing enterprise was one of many trialled by this community to provide economic uplift during an Australian wine boom in export and tourism. So, we can see the cause and effect of why this type of project. Nevertheless, there is no evidence of a special relationship between the Murrin Bridge community and their vineyard. And that is discussed in that previous publication. So the Osoyoos Indian Band's successful engagement in wine growing, winemaking and wine tourism and the contemporary flourishing of Indigenous wine brands in Canada and in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is a counterpoint to that Murrin Bridge history. It's a counterpoint to the Australian experience. Quite likely the difference is related to Australia's lack of land treaties with Indigenous Australians and the systematic racialised exclusion of First Nations people from settler colonial education and economic participation until as recently as the 1980s. So there's some class-based stuff going on here too. These days, there are lots of people who identify as Aboriginal who are middle class and enjoy wine, which is in contrast to the idea of Aboriginal people as somehow helpless alcoholics and drinking cheap wine, which is so that there's I just want to say there is quite an enormous amount of research under these simple sentences that I'm saying to you, particularly Maggie Brady's work, that is about challenging the notion that Aboriginal people are somehow intrinsically vulnerable to alcoholism, and that's why she and I kind of have worked together. So in Canada, Australia and Aotearoa, New Zealand today, there is settler colonial pride and enthusiasm for wine growing. In each of these settler colonial nations, First Peoples too have become attached to Vitis vinifera as a plant, as well as the good life connected with its products and its landscapes. Combined with widening settler colonial support for Indigenous rights and self-determination, the presence of Indigenous vineyard ownership and wine business proprietors, while extremely small in number, is seen as a positive trend by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And what I'm finishing here by saying, and this is how the work that I completed on my study leave finished too. So the future research that needs to be done here is considering the comparative business histories of First Nations wine enterprises in Canada and Aotearoa, New Zealand. Nothing like that's been done for about 20 years, along with 2 new Aboriginal Australian wine brands that have been trading since 2021. Mount Yengo Wines, so not near our Mount Yengo. These are both South Australian companies, Mount Yengo Wines and Munda Wines. These new businesses represent First Nations entrepreneurship and survival in a sector with cultural as well as economic significance in shared histories of ongoing colonisation. Munda means land in the language of the Wirangu and Kakatha peoples. The Munda philosophy is that country speaks through the sensory quality of wines in the same manner as the idea of terroir-based marketing positions certain wines as expressive of locale where their grapes are grown. So this is an Indigenous embrace of something that is a very deep traditional notion of the meaning of what it is when we drink wine. Munda's claim signals a new Australian chapter in Indigenous vinifera relations that is at variance with the Indigenous vinifera settler past that I have talked a little bit about today. So, thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Absolutely fascinating paper and beautifully to time. I would like to throw open the floor to questions. And I might leap in and go first because I'm really interested by...
There were questions, but they're claps. Thanks.
I'm really interested in the intersection of religion and wine and indigeneity there where you've got with your monks. Because I imagine the reason Sovedo and his brethren were growing wine is because of its connection to the sacrament and the need to produce wine for that purposes. So would Indigenous people then, having had Christianity foisted upon them, or perhaps apparently miraculously having chosen to convert en masse, would they have been encountering wine in that religious context if they were excluded from encountering wine in other contexts and also excluded from the vineyards?
I have absolutely no idea from a document base. Speculatively, absolutely not. But I think there are a couple of different reasons for that. My understanding is until Vatican II in the 60s, it was priests who took wine and experienced transubstantiation, not everybody else in the congregation. And no, there was a sense because of again, I'm speculating, but it's informed speculation if everyone's happy to accept that. So that the transubstantiation that you're talking about in both Catholic and High Anglican context was considered to be something that my understanding would be Aboriginal people were excluded from. Yeah. When you say about the idea of wine production by Salvado at New Norcia being focused on sacramental wine, it's really interesting that you asked that. For a long time, there were these assumptions that sacramental wine was what kind of driver production. I would say it isn't. So fundamentally, wine grape cultivation, broadly speaking, it's economic. It's not that sacramental wine. And the other thing with New Norcia is I didn't go into it. It's fine. The records show that fundamentally these monks loved to eat good food, drink good wine. It was more about a Southern European cultural experience for them, in which obviously their religious orders enmeshed, but it's not so much. And the other thing I'd say about sacramental wine that is actually really interesting to me is wine was imported continually to colonial Australia from the point of invasion. So there's always a channel open for wine importation. So there are a few. So I'm just elaborating briefly, which is to say it's known that there are a few places around Australia where historically there seemed to be a focus on sacramental wine, but it's more kind of the other way around, which is monks with a certain amount of, or priests with a certain amount of land and gardening skills and so on, would make wine as a part of the pleasure of being who they were, and presumably bringing some joy to their celibate sort of cerebral lives, I suppose. But yeah, thanks, Sasha.
Other questions? Kathy.
Thanks very much, Julia. I found that really fascinating. I've got a few bubbling thoughts. One of them is that wine growing, viticulture is quite a small industry in some respects, particularly in the 19th century. So they didn't necessarily have a need for great amounts of labour. So you got the case of Blackie, and but we don't see a kind of need for Europeans to draw upon vast numbers of labourers. So is that a factor, do you think, the sort of size? And I want to follow up with another question after that.
So, I really like that question. This is one that the Canadians helped me think through, which is fundamentally, you're speaking about something that doesn't have a lot of reach historically. So why does it matter?
Well, that's not what I'm asking.
No, but they did. Can I tell? If you don't mind me bringing my sense of the pleasure of that. So they did. The Canadians. Right. We took a road trip from Vancouver to Kelowna through a seas, and there's a 5-hour road trip on which the Canadian historian Ben Bryce said, "Why does any of this matter?" And which is a really great opportunity, by the way. Historians should take more road trips together and ask each other this question. So I'm not saying that you're challenging me, but I got to tell you, he was right. in a way that was really interesting for me. So this is why what I tend to be thinking about in relation to the labour question is more about how it is that when we talk about wine growing, it tends to be an economic question, and environmentally. Because it doesn't cover a lot of territory, and Vitis vinifera, I've looked into this, doesn't run wild. It's actually a pretty calm plant. Yeah. It's not like lantana, right? So it's, why does it actually matter? Economically to Australia, it does not matter until the late 1990s. Right. So it's really only mattered to us for a generation. Yeah. So is that the grounds upon which we can ask some of these questions? Well, not so much. But I think it is. So I do find it interesting that so I am convinced that a lot of settler colonists think, even if they're not growing the grapes themselves, they are thinking. So a lot of male settler colonists, we have a couple of women, but that's for another time, are thinking this is a civilizational apotheosis. Yeah. This represents, if there are vineyards, if there's wine that's made locally, yes, there's the economic purpose, which doesn't become eventualized for such a long time, no doubt about that. Yeah. But it's still about civilizing in inverted commas, the landscape. Yeah. And it's about feeling civilized in a place that otherwise feels wild. And where this sense of the very glimpsed history of Fritz and Blackie and other forms of labour in those landscapes is interesting to me is, I guess, as the point at which there's a relationship that exists there, but when I look at it more closely, what it speaks to is the enormous differences that then open up between. Yeah. So is that?
Yeah. I was where my mind is, because I love Brad's work, Born in the Cattle, which is was so important in terms of reimagining Aboriginal people and work with Europeans, in the northern frontier. And so I was thinking. Yes, there are all these repressive tools working against Aboriginal people to be involved, and I totally get your civilisation argument. But also perhaps they, as a population, are popping up in different industries in different ways. So it was just curiosity, really. Yeah.
So that helps me say Anne McGrath's work is absolutely cited, particularly in that first research piece. And the argument we made there in relation to this was, what we found in the case studies in that 2019 publication was we actually called it a curious consonance that occurred. So the Barak relationship with the Dupuis is fascinating. Barak, who was an extraordinary painter, you may know, painted the Dupuis vineyard.
Wow.
And it is the most gorgeous piece of work. It's held in a museum in Switzerland. So I've deliberately not used PowerPoint slides today. You may have noticed I'm being very subversive. So I'll have to paint you a word picture. If you can imagine this artwork where the center of it sort of has these sketched lines that symbolize the straight lines of a vineyard, but then around are these a gorgeous, so it's not realistic in terms of color at all, but these gorgeous eucalypt trees, and it's not just the trees, trunks and branches, and they're obviously leafed, but it's their roots. He's drawn the way the roots go deeply into the ground. Yeah, and then and written on that painting is he talks about the Aboriginal names for that place where the vineyard is and says, this is your land now.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So this is, so it's not the same thing that Anne McGrath encountered in terms of the depth, the breadth of the number of humans involved. Yeah. So here we really just do have a kind of a glimpsed history of a few things.
Yeah, really fascinating. Thank you.
You started to answer something that was at the back of my mind. And thinking about the actual landscape, I mean, when you go around the vineyards, there's a lot of land and there's only a small amount of it dedicated to the vines. Is that a fair description of what they were like historically?
Yeah.
So if we think about what is the relevance of looking at this industry over other industries, is it that this was an industry that could have cohabited with Indigenous people, which could have permitted a life to continue and all the social practices that are dependent upon location? And yet even at that point, our societies fail to do so.
Well, I think I should probably just hand that over to you and step away from my whole career, because I think so. Thank you, Deb. If that idea kind of emerges from what I've talked about, then that's great. There's a part of me resists the idea of thinking that Vitis, vinifera, and the whole culture surrounding it is too virtuous as well. So some of what's driven me to ask these questions about were people involved in settler wine growing who were purported to be introducing this type of civilization to the landscape themselves and so on. What if they were participating in massacres, for example? So when I did a big project a few years ago and I asked that question about the Hunter Valley and its early wine growers. But so what you've said, I have not ever attempted to argue, but I think that, maybe that's implicit in what I'm saying, because that curious consonance of cooperation really interested Maggie Brady and Gillian Barnes and I when we were looking at this, and always reminding ourselves, but it's never an even encounter. But then I just, before I came to give this presentation, I had a completely unexpected and wonderful opportunity to rehearse it with Brooke Collins-Gearing, who's an Aboriginal colleague of ours. And she reflected back that she thinks it's really interesting that this kind of relational history is an opportunity to maybe think exactly as you're saying too. So does this help us understand, in that case, then just how cruel the settler colonial project has been? And it's interesting when you say that, when we compare to that the Algerian situation was completely different, no curious consonance of relationships there, and South Africa is an absolutely foul and brutal scenario where, because it was a huge industry, when the British were able to annex the Cape Colony from the Dutch, it was a massive industry and continued to be. It kind of became the vineyard of Great Britain once the British annexed that port area, but also the vineyards. And the Dutch Boers continued to have their vineyards, but enslaved peoples were doubly enslaved in that they were paid in alcohol. So I don't know how much you know about that history, but there's increasingly work done about that. And so when we lay the Australian context alongside those other comparative opportunities, it kind of makes even more poignant the question you ask.
It's not on that industrial scale. It doesn't require a slave labour force. It could have permitted cohabitation. I thought the Boydell story that you began with is a very powerful one. And I think if today somebody said, hey, look, we've got a group of poor, powerless people, and there's these two charismatic, could we say narcissistic individuals, who we'll put in charge of them. How do we know what happened to them under the care of those two people? How do we know whether that is a healthy or a deeply sinister environment from which people wanted to go away? I mean, you've raised lots of things. But I like the fact you're being questioned on why does it matter, because we should always ask ourselves, why does it matter? Why am I doing this? And I think you can keep pushing with Boydell and the counterfactual of history. What could it have been?
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Umit.
Thank you, Julie. It's really fascinating. I learn a lot. It reminds me of the confiscation of the pistachio land of the Ottoman Armenians in my hometown during the World War I and aftermath. In 50s and 60s, these people who managed to survive ended up in Lebanon and Syria, Aleppo. They used to pay a visit to their hometowns, and they got around these pistachio lands and they tried to collect some, and then took it with them all the way leading up to Europe and then the United States, where they ended up from Aleppo and Syria later on. I kind of try to resonate your work with that kind of experience. I mean, this actually enormous violence, which was a different kind of violence inflicted upon the Armenians in the case of Ottoman Empire. But in your case, how does this help us, contemplate the structure of violence? I mean, I think what you're talking about here, a different form of colonial violence, different structure of colonial violence within the framework of settler colonialism, for sure. I was wondering how you approach this from that kind of vantage point.
Thank you, Umit. And I would just give a plug for the fact that Umit gave a very beautiful guest lecture for my students in the Global Food History course about this very point, to do with pistachio cultivation being something that Armenians lost and that was given to Turks. Yeah. So it's a great question, and so I would say, for the most part, I draw on the work of other people to help me explain some of that structural violence. The glimpse that I'm able to give of the particular stories I've told, I think are really, they're fundamentally relevant together within the context of this bigger project that was published, which was called Settler Vines. So, I'm not going to claim any more significance for it than that, except that when we look at, so if we take as the framework the idea of settler colonial wine growing, as the Settler Vines project did, and then we apply that in contexts such as Australia, as I have, and I lean into Canada, and the other people within that project really did not focus, as I have done, on this kind of relational history. They were more focused on only the settler colonial part of it. So, Umit, I don't know that I am adding anything necessarily in an enormous way to the historiography of an understanding structural violence here. But I don't mind, because really where my work is located is in understanding how cultivation landscapes, the cultural within the economic, changes over time, and how it is that we ought to draw in a cultural perspective. And for me, that's been an Indigenous perspective, it's a gendered perspective, a class perspective, and so on. So I'm very much a product of that period where I guess I'm would we call me a post-structuralist, Umit? Would we call me a post-structuralist? In that, I hope what my work does is re-entangles a sense of agents within structures where change can and can't happen, which is overlaid onto perhaps our usual methodologies of cause and effect as historians. Yeah, not sure if that's a satisfactory answer for you, but I'm really glad you asked the question.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I like the notion of relational history, actually. I heard that for the first time, relational social sciences, but I didn't know that was also a methodology in the discipline of history, relational history. I haven't heard of that earlier.
Oh, okay. So that is really interesting. If I may just respond to that point. How are we going?
We're pretty much on the end, so
all right,
make it very fun.
Yeah, I'm going
Cracking the whip
to be fast about this, Umit. We'll have to talk about this offline. So in the piece that I just talked about, I said I am not attempting to decolonize, because here's what I understand decolonial history to be. I am not attempting to indigenize, because here is what I understand indigenizing history to be. I am attempting a relational history, because what I understand that to be is thinking about how relationships within a particular question or framework that we ask allow us to see Indigenous survival at the same time in this instance as we see, say, economic change, environmental change, and so on. So the kind of multifarity of methodologies that I have often worked with, which I refer to as I will play in everyone's sandbox, you watch me. So that sort of preparedness that I have epistemologically to ask questions that might require a different kind of approaches. Relational history ends up, for me, in fact, being this interesting encompassment. The last thing I would say is the conversation I had before I came in to give the presentation with our colleague Colin Gearing was exactly on this point. And so she's an English literature scholar, and we were talking about the fact that for her, what she could see here was the idea of relational ontologies informing a methodology. So maybe this is something that we can discuss further.
Thank you, Julie, for an absolutely fascinating paper, and the privilege of those people who are in the room as we get to drag you off and interrogate you over coffee after you have time to do so. Just before everyone goes, a quick note that our next event will be next Friday, the 25th of October from 10 a.m. and will be online and in person once again. And our speaker will be James Hunter from the Maritime Museum, who will present on More Surprises Await, the Potential for Future Historic Shipwreck Archaeology on Newcastle's Oyster Bank and surrounding coastline. And we hope to see you then.